Welcome, everybody. I'm excited to be joined by Ethan here from Vanta. We're going to be talking about or continue the conversation about leveraging SOC 2 work to achieve the HITRUST E1. If you're unfamiliar with what the E1 is or who HITRUST is, we're going to dive into all of that fun stuff. So we're going to be talking about the advantages of leveraging the Vanta platform. But like I said earlier, if you can get your questions into the chat in real time, it would be really helpful, because what Ethan and I want to do is, one, make this engaging, but in doing so, we want to answer your questions as best we can in real time based on the topics that are happening. So we will have Q&A at the end, but if you have anything that's really burning in your mind, don't hesitate. And it looks like it was -8 in the Twin Cities today. I definitely don't miss that.
It's tough.
So, all right, we'll do some quick intros. My name is Ryan Patrick. I'm the Vice President of Adoption at HITRUST. My role is multifaceted in that I am an educator. So I do things like this, but I also talk to the market every single day, trying to educate the market on what HITRUST is doing. But also, and in my mind, more importantly, I want to learn from the market and then educate the folks internal at HITRUST, who we keep locked in a room, those really big brains that are thinking about where HITRUST is going in the future that we don't let out. I want to educate them on what the market's needs, wants, and desires are. My background is primarily in healthcare cybersecurity. Worked for a health system in their security office. I've worked for several different professional service firms, conducting everything from penetration testing and tabletop exercises, risk assessments, and everything in between. And I am excited to be joined by Ethan. You want to introduce yourself real quick, please?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Ryan. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Ethan Heller. I am on Vanta's GRC team. So for folks who aren't sure what GRC is, it's governance, risk, and compliance. I've run into that a lot lately, so I make sure to explain that. A lot of what I do is really get to work with our customers and really help them implement their GRC program, whatever it might be, whether that be implementing something like HITRUST or any sort of other compliance or security framework that they want to tackle. It's an awesome gig for me. Background experience is I started off my career as an auditor. I'm mostly doing SOC 1s, SOC 2s, and then moving more into the security and privacy space, working with a lot of customers and to enable them to really stand up that GRC program and be able to scale it over time. So it's a really great opportunity for me at Vanta to work with customers from all different types of industries, backgrounds all over the world, to really help them manage their GRC program in a really efficient manner and allow them to really do things that they weren't able to do prior to using a platform like Vanta. So I'm really excited to dig into this conversation about HITRUST with Ryan today. I think it's going to be really valuable for everybody here.
Yeah, as a quick sidebar, the term or the acronym GRC has been around for 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
But I feel like it's really starting to come into its own right now. There's a lot more conversations happening around GRC. So feel free to sprinkle any of that wisdom and knowledge and experience into these comments or this presentation, please. So quick agenda. As I mentioned, we're going to talk about the E1. We're going to talk a little bit about why and who HITRUST is, and then we're going to kind of dissect to a certain degree how you can leverage the work you've done against SOC 2 within the Vanta platform to, one, understand where you may sit against getting HITRUST certified, but also, and probably more importantly, work to reach the bar for certification right there in the Vanta platform. And we'll have a live demo at the end to kind of visualize. I always tell people, I'm just a dumb Army guy. I like pictures more than I like words. So being able to visualize these things, I think, will be really, really helpful. So I'm going to start off with what is the HITRUST E1. So to talk about the E1, I kind of got to give you a little bit of a history lesson. So HITRUST was founded over 17 years ago. And what we were trying to do back then, I was not a part of HITRUST at the time, but our founder was trying to solve what I call the HIPAA problem. And the HIPAA problem was that the law was written so vague, and it had to be written so vague, so it applies to the masses and stands the test of time, that it left more questions than answers on what the healthcare industry was trying to do. So when HITRUST was founded, our founder, along with several other industry stakeholders, built this framework to be much more prescriptive, and then built an assurance program on top of that to produce reliable assurances and reliable outcomes based on the framework itself. And for the longest, about 15 years of that 17 years, we had one assessment. It was just called the HITRUST Validated Assessment. And 2 years ago, we came out with our I1, which stands for Implemented 1 Year. And then in 2023, we came out with the E1, which stands for Essentials 1 Year. And really, what the E1 is designed to do is multifaceted, actually. One, it's designed to be leveraged by organizations that present low levels of risk or the lowest level of risk to their customers, their business partners, to whomever that party is requesting the assurance and trying to instill trust. And it's focused on, as the name says, the absolute essentials. I always tell people that if you're not doing these 44 things, you need to rethink your life, because you are about to invite headache and heartache into it in the near future. So it's everything from encryption to MFA to business continuity, transmission security. Everything that you would expect in a larger HITRUST assessment is boiled down into the 19 domains and the 44 requirements in those 19 domains. And the second use case, or the other way it's being leveraged, is kind of as an on-ramp to HITRUST, because HITRUST has proven itself to be actually a risk reduction effort, because it's a forcing function and a trust but verified type of certification. You actually have to do these things and prove that you're doing these things. People aren't ready for that really robust assessment that used to be called the HITRUST Validated Assessment, which has now been renamed as the HITRUST R2 assessment. A lot of organizations are not ready to get there. When I used to do HITRUST assessments prior to coming to HITRUST, I had customers, it could take them 18 to 24 months to understand where they're at, remediate, and then ultimately get validated and certified. So it was a huge lift, and the E1 is here to help organizations start somewhere, because the 44 controls that are in the E1 are at the core of that I1 that I mentioned. There's 182 controls in the I1. The 182 controls of the I1 are at the core of the R2. So what we've done is we've built this nested approach to maturing and improving a security program over time through the full HITRUST portfolio. So you don't have to lose work that you've done against the E1 as you go to I1 or you go to R2. You've already satisfied those controls, and you can re-leverage that work and that understanding for larger or higher assurance mechanisms, primarily the I1 and the R2 within HITRUST. So we're going to get into this a little bit in a future slide, but I want to plant a seed. It's right there. I think it's the fifth bullet on this slide. It talks about being threat adaptive. And as someone who used to be a really cool security guy doing really cool things, who's now just a talking head, the fact that we are basing the control selection off of actual threat data consistently, not continuously. It's not an everyday effort for us. We're doing it on a quarterly basis. We're selecting the controls not because we feel like we're the smartest people in the room and we say that these are the things that you should be doing. It's actually the threats that are happening in the wild today, the things that are actively trying to be exploited. These controls protect against those, and I'll get into more details on what that is. But that's, to me, the exciting part of what HITRUST is doing today is the relevancy of the controls is without compare in my mind, because nobody is doing it as consistently as we are. So, Ethan, I'll pause there. Maybe I'll take a breath. Maybe I'll drink some water. Any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think that absolutely. I think the threat adaptive approach, I think, is really one of like the unique value add that HITRUST has, where, compared to some other security frameworks. Like, a lot of folks on the call are probably familiar with some other legacy security frameworks and understand that updates to those do not happen very often. They just don't. That's just, there's plenty of reasons behind that, but I think that's really something that separates HITRUST, where it's always going to be relevant, and it's specifically taking into account the current threat landscape. So you're actually addressing the cybersecurity needs of today. So that's something that I always focus on when I talk about HITRUST. I think is really unique. And also ultimately, we're talking about not just getting the certification, but also improving your security posture over time. I think that becomes a really key concept there. And also it really allows security and compliance teams to really work in tandem to be able to implement these controls that really is safeguarding their environment and their data on a continuous basis over time. So 100%, I love that. I always love honing in on that point.
Yeah, and people will often ask, what do I get out of getting HITRUST certified? And besides the obvious, risk reductions, because as I mentioned, you're forced to improve things. It's not like a SOC 2, and this is not to pick on SOC 2, but I'm just drawing a comparison here. You don't actually have to fix anything, and you can get a you can get a SOC 2 report. So it will be a qualified opinion, which is not a good thing, but you can still get that. Whereas if your goal is to achieve certification, you actually have to raise the bar. You actually have to get better. And oh, by the way, HITRUST doesn't do any of the audit work. So if you think that HITRUST as an organization is going to come in and test and validate and things of that nature, that's not the case. Similar to SOC 2, we have a community of what we call external assessors, and they're the ones charged with working with the entity looking for certification to scope the assessment, do readiness work, do remediation work, and ultimately do the testing and validation. Vanta included in that pool. So you are going to make changes, and it's not always capital investment types of changes. It could be simple configuration changes for that matter, but it is a risk reduction effort. People and organizations are actually closing gaps and reducing risk just by pursuing the certification itself. But as we mentioned, it's not just for the sake of doing these 44 things. It's because these are the things that are actually going to protect your organization, protect data, and protect the interests that you may have with your business partners, with your customers, or whomever else. So the idea of pursuing an E1 has gained a lot of traction in the market. It's actually the fastest growing, quote unquote, assessment within the HITRUST portfolio. We're seeing more and more organizations gravitating towards the E1 because of that stepping stone approach, because of the value it adds. And it's logical and natural to try to leverage the work that you've done in other places. I'm a huge proponent of reducing redundant efforts. I am on my soapbox every day working with state and federal government trying to build this whole idea of reciprocity between standards, frameworks, or regulations. And the conversation today around SOC 2 is in line with that. It doesn't make sense to do a SOC 2 independently and then have to do it HITRUST independently when you could, in theory, do them both at the same time. But if you already have a SOC 2, this is where we're going to get into kind of the details here, is you can leverage that work in a couple of different ways for HITRUST certification, right? So not unlike SOC 2, HITRUST has a field work period. It's condensed in comparison to SOC 2. Everything has to be done within a 90-day period. But you can leverage the work that was done in the broader SOC 2 field work period for HITRUST. And oh, by the way, that SOC 2 report, if there is a match between the control for the SOC 2 and HITRUST, almost an identical match, that report itself becomes the evidence in the HITRUST certification. So there's a way of reusing that work for HITRUST based on that SOC 2 as well. So there was a question that came into the chat, Ethan. It says, how much does an E1 add on top of a SOC 2? How much overlap in the controls are there? So I'm gonna start off and answer. And if you have any thoughts, I'd love you to jump in. So like any good security professional, I'm going to answer with it depends. So HITRUST is prescriptive and it's in theory a static set of controls, meaning that you don't, as the entity being assessed, get to pick your controls. HITRUST has picked them for you. Whereas SOC 2, you have a lot more control in what controls are being selected. So to give you an exact quantification that it's 50 or 75% is really hard to do because there's not a lot of commonality from SOC 2 to SOC 2 because the entity being assessed actually gets to pick that, and obviously the auditor has a say. So what we've done is we actually have a mapping, and you can look in the Vanta platform to show the work that you've done against SOC 2 that actually applies to the HITRUST work. But I would say, based on some of the numbers I've seen, and some generalizations and assumptions that have been made, I would say it's about 50% ish direct mapping and overlap. But Ethan, I'm curious what you're seeing on your side.
No, exactly. I definitely want to reiterate the scoping aspect here, because it really does depend on what is in scope for your SOC 2. Because the folks who have been dealing with SOC 2 know it's pretty flexible standard. Your control scope is going to look a lot different than some other organizations' control scope. And that's going to be based off of a risk-based approach, based off of the controls that you need in scope to meet those SOC 2 requirements. But in general, what we see is about a 50% overlap in general. Because like we talked about HITRUST, and we're talking about those essential controls, they really are those essential critical controls that any security team, any organization should have in place. And that's essentially what should be in place for SOC 2 as well, right? When we're talking about a SOC 2 report is only as good as those controls that you have mapped to those requirements in place. And there's really is going to be that significant overlap, especially in key domains, like the ones we already mentioned before, but that on top of that, things like access control, things like change control, things like vulnerability and risk analysis. Like these are going to be things that are always going to kind of most likely going to find in the SOC 2 report, and things that you'll 100% find in the HITRUST E1. So really those key domains do overlap. And again, depends on control scope, but usually you're going to see around that, generally speaking, that 50% overlap or so.
Yeah, and if you're looking at the slide, there's several bullets that I'm not going to read to you all, but kind of breaks it down. And this goes to a question that just came into the chat around, if I want to do a SOC 2 and an E1, which one should I do first? And if it were up to me and this was utopia, I would say do them both at the same time, right? Because you're going to gain efficiencies in that way. If that's not practical, as the biased HITRUST guy on the call, I'm going to say start with the E1 because of all the things I've said to this point, risk reduction effort, actually protecting you against the threats that are happening in the wild today, so on and so forth. But that may not be practical. You may have a customer that's saying, do an E1 or do a SOC 2. If that's the case, the right side of this slide is where you want to pay attention. And what's not on this slide that actually will make the effort a little bit lighter is in the SOC 2 world, if let's say you're in the cloud, you're using one of the main cloud providers, you can actually carve that portion of the assessment out and not have to worry about the controls that GCP, Azure, AWS are managing on your behalf. In the HITRUST world, there typically isn't carve outs. For the E1, you're allowed to carve out, but what we're seeing is because we've set a precedent that we don't allow carve outs with the R2, nobody's doing carve outs now. And all of those major cloud providers are HITRUST certified. So you can actually leverage the work they've done against their assessment and certification as a part of your assessment and certification. So you can pull that information directly into your assessments, which again lightens the load. So, and we'll make up the numbers. Ethan and I both kind of landed on about a 50% overlap. Let's say 25% of that remaining 50 is controls managed by your cloud provider. That really only leaves 25% that's solely on the back of your organization. And when you're only talking about 44 controls, that's not a ton of work. And I will tell you that between the SOC 2 that you've done, your cloud provider, the inheritance, and all the integrations that Vanta has built into the platform, that effort is become a lot lighter. Ethan, I don't know if you have any thoughts or comments.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I think in the perfect world, you do both of them at the same time because, they feed into each other. And also because E1 does have that aspect of being threat adaptive and being a framework that really incorporates a lot of these different requirements from also all of these different standards. But of course, SOC 2 is a lot of, I used to do some third-party risk type of stuff. And if anyone's dealt with procurement, that SOC 2 a lot of the times is just going to be demanded, and that's going to be really the table stakes sometimes. So of course, if you're dealing with those tight timelines and you just need to say, hey, we need the SOC 2 because we have some business that's relying on it, of course, and that path may make sense. But 100%, if you can do these two in tandem because they feed into each other so well, that's really the ideal point to go from. And also the value of E1 too is that that's your baseline assurance level. Like you have some customers where you want to prove out assurance at a deeper level and then go into some of the higher levels of HITRUST, you're really in a really good position to start scaling your program ultimately. And that's something that with the variety of threats and with the sensitivity of data that a variety of organizations are intaking, that's where HITRUST becomes really valuable because you can really prove that assurance that you were safeguarding that sensitive data. So ideal world, both for sure. But of course, there are going to be those external needs that might drive which one you might go with over the other.
And there's a ton of questions popping in, and I'm going to sprinkle them in as we're going. But Ethan, I was hoping that you could walk us through, because we're talking about kind of the overlap and the mappings. Walk us through, just an example of the controls.
Yeah, so we have a couple of examples here. Just really what we wanted to show is really that parity between HITRUST and SOC 2 to be able to see clearly how those requirements and controls relate to each other. So what we have here is on the left-hand side, we just have the E1 requirement. And on the right-hand side, we have SOC 2's trust service criteria. Now, I do want to just touch on what trust service criteria are, just because a lot of the times for folks who haven't done SOC 2, that might be a question that you might have. So trust service criteria, I would like to consider those really the 5 main requirements and domains of SOC 2. And those are security, availability, confidentiality, processing integrity, and privacy. So that's really the overall scope of SOC 2 when we talk about these key domains that you need that you would tackle with SOC 2. With SOC 2, security is the only one that's required, with those additional ones coming at some additional considerations for your organization. Just to take a look at this first example here, our first control looking at here is related to backups, right? Backup controls and requirements are going to be pretty much across the board in every security framework, right? Because it's such a key aspect to your security program. On the right hand, so on the left, it says organization maintains offline and immutable backups of data. On the right hand side, we see the availability criteria, which is the criteria that deals a lot with availability and capacity, and ensuring you have those redundancies in place so your services can continue without disruption. We have 80.1.2 that also focuses on backups. Now, of course, SOC 2 is a little bit more broad. This is what we touched on before, where HITRUST is a bit more prescriptive. Or in SOC 2, there's a little bit more up for interpretation, we can say. But of course, a standard control map to 8.1.2 is going to be related to backups. But again, I always like to make sure to call that one out because HITRUST clearly is a lot more prescriptive of a framework, which also feeds into starting with E1 because it really gives you that set of controls where you clearly can know the path forward on how to address those. And then some of the other ones here. We're talking. Our second one is like phishing awareness training. That's something that every organization that I've been a part of has started doing in the recent years, just because of the sheer amount of phishing attacks that we've seen across the board. And on the right hand side here, again, we're going to see one of SOC 2's security criteria here. The entity internally communicates information and objectives for internal control. Again, pretty broad here. And that's, again, where that value of going for that E1 also fits in here, because you can clearly demonstrate that you have these controls in place to meet these broader SOC 2 criteria. But again, there is that overlap. And of course, the last one here, just to end on some of our examples here, is really controls related to firewalls. Again, going to be a control that's going to be in scope for E1 and almost always going to be in scope for SOC 2. Of course, the SOC 2 language, again, is more broad. So that's, again, that value of E1, being able to really give you that prescriptive guidance in terms of what to actually implement there would really help feed into SOC 2. But this demonstration, I think, hopefully you guys can see that there's going to be that significant overlap and how E1 and SOC 2 really feed into each other pretty well. Yeah, and Ryan, we'll also love your take on that, prescriptiveness versus kind of SOC 2's more kind of broader trust service criteria requirements as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can get on my soapbox pretty darn quick. But again, SOC 2 serves, in my mind, a very specific function for an organization, and the flexibility is built for that specific function, which is, in my mind, again, Ryan's opinion, take it for what it's worth, is to ascertain maturity internal to an organization for management to understand kind of where they stand, and they can be really focused on what's important to them through the SOC 2. But when you talk about like in a TPRM scenario where someone else that does not understand who you are, what you're doing, how you conduct your business from a security perspective. I'm not convinced the SOC 2 is absolutely the right answer because there's so much flexibility and it's much more vague. It's left to interpretation, whereas HITRUST is really prescriptive. If you look at the slide here, and I'm pointing off screen because I have my screen over here. So anyway, if you look at the slide, these are just the requirement statements. There's actually elements within the requirements themselves that even get a little bit more granular. Again, telling organizations exactly what they need to do, protect against those threats. So yes, it's more prescriptive. Again, biased HITRUST Ryan here going to say, if you have to choose between the two, I would start with HITRUST because it's actually easier to use HITRUST work and port that over to a SOC 2 because you're going from something super prescriptive and super direct to something that's a little less prescriptive. It opens the aperture to a certain degree. So again, business needs are business needs. Business drivers will make the world go round. But if in that world, if there's a way to do HITRUST first, in my opinion, now this is probably the third time I'm going to say it, I would start with HITRUST. All right, I want to see if we can get into one specific question that came in, which is, would we not be able to use a SOC 2 to support E1 testing if SOC 2 fieldwork did not align with the 90-day E1 fieldwork period? It's a great question. So the answer is yes, you can use that SOC 2, even though the report was generated outside the fieldwork period. The report would just have to be generated. Let me rephrase that. The auditor would have to receive that report and test and validate that report, primarily make sure the scope of the SOC 2 is the same scope for HITRUST, that the controls that are wanting to be leveraged line up with the requirements for HITRUST. That's the testing and validating of that report. But you can provide that SOC 2 report as an input or as evidence that the control is in place and functioning the way it's supposed to function based on the scoping and that alignment between the controls. Okay. Let's move on to the next slide. There's tons of questions. I'm going to, again, sprinkle those in as we get to them, but worst case, we'll tackle them all at the end of the presentation. So why should you trust HITRUST? Well, it's in the name, right? Bad joke. I apologize. I need some more coffee. But it really boils down to the numbers, right? So we talked about the threat adaptive nature of the HITRUST assessments. What that means is, I mentioned we're doing this work, this analysis on a quarterly basis, and we're not just making it up. We're ingesting threat intelligence, threat data from a threat provider that's already been mapped to the MITRE ATT&CK framework's TTPs. So it's saying, hey, this threat is happening and these are the TTPs that they're using. We take that information and we look at the mitigations that are recommended by MITRE for those specific TTPs, and we bounce that off of the control selection of the E1 and the I1. And if we identify a flat out gap, we don't have a control that is addressing that attack vector, we will make a change. We will change a control. We will develop a control. Or, and this is actually what we've seen based on 2 years of doing this, we just may be missing just an elemental level, meaning we have a control, but there's just a tweak that has to happen within the control to protect against that threat. That's what we'll do. So we're doing that on a quarterly basis. And you may be like, Ryan, so what? Like, why does that matter? And I want to draw your attention to the bottom right of the slide, that 0.6%. That number represents the number of breaches within HITRUST certified environments in 2022 and 2023. Less than 1%. I see statistics, breach rates all the time, and the numbers, they generally fluctuate. But the lowest one I've seen is 53% of organizations in 2023 had an incident. So HITRUST, less than 1%, statistically more likely than not to have an incident without HITRUST in that 53%. That's why it matters. That's why the threat-based assessments matter. This is why that risk reduction really matters. So if you leave with nothing else, think about that 0.6%. And you may be wondering, because this was my first question when I saw the statistic when it was released in April, well, how are we trending for 2024? And I can tell you, it's not complete yet, but we are trending down. We're actually at 0.5% for 2024. So we're still seeing that consistency from a breach perspective within HITRUST certified environments. Okay. I'm going to touch on just a little bit of this because I really do want to get into the demo and definitely want to jump into these questions because they're continuing to fly in. Other than the risk reduction, other than the ability to get through the gates, if you will, from a procurement perspective with a lot of primarily healthcare organizations, but that is now starting to grow in other industries, there's additional ROI specifically within the cyber insurance space. So we have done the work, done the education with brokers, underwriters, and carriers of cyber insurance. And we've shown them the efforts and what it takes to get through HITRUST certification. And they're like, wow, this is pretty good stuff here. And they have actually built a HITRUST specific cyber insurance product. And what that means is right now it's just for the R2, but the plan in 2025 is to expand it to the E1 and the I1. If you have R2 certification for HITRUST, you actually will start your application with a 25% credit on your policy for cyber insurance. There's nothing else out there, not SOC 2, nothing based on NIST, there's nothing based on ISO that is doing this same thing from a cyber insurance product perspective. And we actually have a consortium now that was approved by Lloyd's of London where there's more and more carriers coming to the table to jump in on this product because they do feel like it's a better investment in HITRUST certified environments. Ethan, anything from your perspective and working with HITRUST / SOC 2 customers that you've seen from an ROI perspective? I know I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah, no, I think from my perspective, I mean, definitely the healthcare space, but also I do want to highlight that's growing in terms of industries that are really looking at HITRUST as a gold standard for a third-party certification on the security program. That's something, a couple of years ago, you really mostly saw in the healthcare space. That's really where I would certainly run into it, whether it would be mostly, being more like healthcare organizations that touch PHI, protect health information, that really saw that value there. But now it's really being permeated across a variety of industries, and it's really focusing more on, hey, if you have sensitive data, HITRUST is a really great certification for you to ensure that you are safeguarding that data. So I think that's a key point that I like to call out too, because I think some folks still kind of have that healthcare mindset sometimes, but this is growing beyond that at a pretty significant rate. So I think you run into finance, you run into all technology even these days. It's certainly permeated beyond that. So that's definitely something when we talk about differentiation. HITRUST is really becoming well respected across multiple industries now.
For sure. And I'm going to cruise through this slide because I really want to get, like I said, into some of the future stuff in the presentation. But you may be wondering, well, what the heck does it take to get E1 certified? And this slide's a little bit busy, so I'm gonna simplify it a bit. There's really, in my mind, 4 steps. You got to scope the assessment, very similar to SOC 2. You probably want to do some kind of readiness or benchmarking, identify any gaps, remediate those gaps, and then ultimately just get validated and submit it for certification. It sounds super easy, and in comparison to the R2, it is a lot easier, and it can happen a lot faster. We've seen organizations get through the E1 in I don't want to say a couple weeks. I shouldn't say that. I've seen it as quickly as about 6 to 8 weeks, on average about 3 months. And the reason for that is because a lot of times most people are doing the majority of these 44 things. There may be just a couple of things that they need to change or tweak, and then obviously get through the field work period. So it's not as arduous as it has been to get HITRUST certified with the R2 and even the I1. That one takes a bit more effort. So it is an on-ramp, so to speak, but follows the same methodology around the assurance and the quality requirements for HITRUST certification. So we still look at every single assessment. We still QA every single assessment in multiple fashions. We actually have 6 different levels of QA for every single HITRUST assessment, inclusive of the E1. So you're not sacrificing any of the quality that HITRUST has been built on over 17 years with the E1. You're still getting all of that. So I think at this point, I'm going to do a lot less talking, and I'm going to turn it over to Ethan.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Ryan, for all of that. And so this is where Vanta can jump in here. We talk about what Vanta is. We really are that first automated solution to actually offer a pre-built HITRUST assessment, meaning that within the Vanta platform itself, we actually have a framework set up for HITRUST. And the way we can do that is with our partnership with HITRUST. And what I'm going to talk about later is also our integration with the MyCSF platform, the platform where those assessments need to be done for HITRUST. So definitely I'm excited to be able to actually show you that live, because I think it's easy for me to say it, but to show it really will drive that point home, and hopefully you'll be able to see how valuable that integration is. So just to really just talk about Vanta at a high level before we dive in a little bit deeper here. Vanta is an automation platform first and foremost, and we are a trust management platform. So we leverage any integration we can make with a variety of your tech stack, and I'll show you this in real time. Things like your infrastructure provider, things like your identity provider, things like your version control. And we can actually test hourly to ensure that those critical security controls are in place in your environment. And of course, this is going to relate directly to those HITRUST requirements, because then those tests are able to, one, ensure that you're meeting the HITRUST controls, and also generate that evidence that you need for those assessments. So how that works, and I'm just going to walk you through here. We have a little bit of I call it the cake diagram, just to show the different layers here, like a nice layer cake. At the bottom here, just the platform, like I spoke about, those integrations. That's going to be the key piece that actually enables that continuous monitoring of your environment over time, ensuring that you are staying up to date with your security controls, ensuring that they are in place and your environment is secure. So on top of that, we built that I would say the first layer is the GRC part, right? The part that we're discussing here today. Managing frameworks like HITRUST, like SOC 2, like ISO 27001. Being able to manage your policies, being able to do your risk assessments, which are going to be required across the board for every security framework that you will be tackling. And not only do we stop there, we don't stop there, I should say. We go straight into other security workflows that are really going to be incredibly important for not only your overall security program, but also to achieve certifications like HITRUST, with doing things like security awareness training, managing your people, making sure that they're taking those necessary onboarding steps, making sure that they are taking their training, going through background checks. And then, of course, vendor risk management, right? That's a topic that I think everyone on this call has heard a lot lately. Making sure that your vendors are meeting your security standards, making sure you're taking into account those supply chain risks. And then lastly, demonstrating trust, right? And at the end of the day, you need to be able to demonstrate trust to your customers and to your partners. And to do that, we have what we call a trust center, which is really an external page where you can directly demonstrate that trust to customers, as well as really service any of those key security communications that you want your customer base to know about. So going right along here, Vantrust E1 solution, right? Because that's the topic of today. What does it actually look like? Well, we have the 44 HITRUST controls, like Ryan was talking about earlier, directly within the platform. I'm going to show you that shortly, as well as a mixture of automated tests. You can see here 126 automated tests. That's going to be based off of those integrations that you hook up, being able to test for things like, we mentioned MFA before. Do you have MFA in place? Are you doing proper change reviews? Are you ensuring that you're deprovisioning access in a timely manner? And then, of course, being able to also give you document templates and policy templates to ensure that you are, one, supporting all the evidence, making sure that you can actually supply that manual evidence with the correct guidance, with that prescriptive guidance, so you know exactly what to provide, and also give you those policy templates to meet the HITRUST requirements, in addition to other frameworks like SOC 2 and the others, and a bunch of others that you'll be able to see in just a moment here. So I basically just covered how Vanta works. I actually want to show you this in real time, because this slide can get a bit much, but like I talked about before, it starts with hooking up your systems. Then it actually goes into actually completing your evidence policies, the actual groundwork for what you need to do to get ready for that assessment, making sure that you're staying in compliance. That continuous monitoring is going to be a key value add here. So to ensure that over the time of these assessments that you're actually staying in compliance and that you can actually meet these requirements. And of course, going through the HITRUST assessment process and actually getting that certification. So, and on the bottom here, we just threw down some of the auditors that work with Vanta and HITRUST to actually, we talked about how third parties actually have to come in and do these assessments. really driving that point home of how important independence is for them. So really an all-inclusive platform to really help you get to your high trust assurance level that you want to get you that certification. So with that, I'm actually going to jump right into the demo here because I know we want to definitely get to questions, and the demo can take some time because it's a pretty big platform. But what you'll be able to see here is that we do harmonize all these different controls, requirements, all these different evidence items, these automated tests to really permeate across multiple frameworks. So the work that you do for SOC 2 can be used for HITRUST, and the work that you do for HITRUST can also be leveraged for SOC 2 and other frameworks as well. And that's also another key aspect and a key topic that we're talking about here, right? The parity between the two and being able to tackle both of those. So let's just jump right into it. Now let's see if we can share the screen here.
The moment of panic. Will the demo work?
Will it work? Let's see. We tested it out, so hopefully we should be in a good position here. Yeah, and Ryan, I'll ask you to let me know if you can see.
Yep, me and
screen here.
Yep.
Amazing. Love it when technology works the way we want it to, right? So this is Vanta. This is the actual platform. This is my demo account, so it's going to look pretty clean because I try to keep it clean because it can get pretty crazy pretty quickly. But this is the homepage when you log in. You're going to get that nice welcome. You're going to see the llama. But of course, the first step that we always talk about Vanta is connecting in those systems, making those integrations that are the key aspect for that continuous monitoring. So actually, I'm going to pop over into one of our other demo environments so we can actually see that my CSF integration along with all the other integrations that we offer. As you can see, it's going to be quite a lot. That's, we always say we're an automation platform. So we want to be able to support you and whatever systems that you're working on to ensure that you have those proper security controls in place at those systems. So as an example here, right, the first one I talked about was was the infrastructure providers, things like AWS, Azure, GCP. These are going to be very key for pretty much all of your compliance efforts, in addition to version controls like GitHub, GitLab, and of course your identity providers, right, the Googles, the Oktas of the world. So just to give you an example of what we mean by automated testing, because I think that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So just want to show you here. These are our resources. Going to click here, but I'll show you on my other cleaner account. But basically what I really want to show you here is actually how we integrate with my CSF. And I think this is really relevant, obviously, to the topic today, but also something that really separates Vanta. Really is because of this partnership we have with HITRUST, where you can actually connect HITRUST My CSF, right, that assessment platform of HITRUST, with Vanta. So what does that actually mean? I think for a lot of folks, it can mean a lot of different things. Again, what that means is that any of the evidence that you are working on in Vanta, any of those key controls that you're addressing in Vanta, that evidence will be ported over into my CSF. So you don't have to go between two different places, right? We're talking about reducing duplicative work, right? That's something that that Vanta and HITRUST are passionate about. This is a key aspect to that. So you don't have to be doing all this kind of mundane, a little bit tedious type of work to move everything over into two different platforms. We can house it directly within Vanta. And you can see here, actually, if I even hit manage and edit, you can actually see the exact assessment that this is going to within my CSF. So it's a very seamless integration. We always say making integration is very quick. We make it very easy. And this is going to be really a key aspect for you if you're leveraging Vanta to work towards that HITRUST certification. Now, I'm going to pop back over into my much cleaner demo account because that one has a lot of things hooked up and can get very complicated. I want to go back to the integrations just to show you what some of these automated tests I was talking about, because I think that will just give you an idea of the power of an automation platform. So I'm just going to quick use AWS as an example here. It's one of our strongest integrations. Is of course the cloud provider of probably a lot of folks on the call today, so it will be very, very relevant here. So here are some of the automated tests that we're running on an hourly basis on your AWS environment to ensure that you have these key security controls in place. Things that you're going to see here, like accounts being reviewed, things like MFA in place, making sure you have capacity monitoring in place, making sure that you are appropriately provisioning access, making sure that your load balancers are in place and that monitoring is there. Just some of that, we have 130 here, right? I can keep going down the list, but these are all going to tie back to your HITRUST controls, to your SOC 2 controls, to ensure that you're meeting those and also automatically collect that evidence as well. So it's really very powerful to leverage automation here too. Also the idea of continuous insurance, right? Compliance not being a point in time type of initiative. We can actually ensure that your environment is staying secure over time with these automated tests. Now, in terms of what we spoke about before, in terms of, hey, I want to manage HITRUST within Vanta, what does that look like? Well, because of our partnership, we have that pre-built framework, and that's for E1, I1, as well as R2. So any level of assurance that you're going with HITRUST, you can leverage Vanta for that. And I'm going to show you exactly what it looks like here. So I have HITRUST E1 enabled in my demo account, and kind of similar to what we're talking about here, you can see those key requirement categories on the left, and then you actually can see all of the controls, those 44 controls that we were speaking of before, broken down per those requirements into a very granular level. So you can see exactly how you are meeting those HITRUST controls with those tests, those automated tests, and with those manual evidence items that I spoke of, that I touched on earlier. So it really is a wonderful way to make sure that you are meeting those HITRUST controls, and then ensures that you're doing it over time as well, right? Continuous security assurance. I'm always going to talk about that because I really am passionate about that. And of course, any evidence that you have here, right? The tests, these documents, that's the evidence form. Because you made that MyCSF integration, that's going to be automatically ported over into MyCSF. So you'll have it in your assessment within MyCSF for HITRUST. And as well, of course, because we're talking about, we were a GRC platform, here comes that buzzword again. We're taking into account risk as well, and overall governance, but I call out risk here because you also map out these risk scenarios from your risk register to your controls to ensure that, hey, we've identified risks. Let's demonstrate that we have controls in place to mitigate that risk. And that's what makes Vanta such a powerful platform, is they can really tie all of these key security risk management areas together and really see a program holistically on how it's actually mitigating risks over time. And just to show you again, I luckily already have HITRUST in here just to show you that how we have all those controls. You can see 44 controls at the bottom here. These are all of those HITRUST E1 controls. Of course, if you have a different level of HITRUST, whether that be I1 or R2, you're going to have more controls. But here, I think it gives you a pretty good view of what those controls in the Vanta platform looks like. And you're able to assign things like owners. You'll be able to see, okay, where exactly does this control map to in HITRUST? And you'll be also able to see all those evidence items that you have in place to meet those controls. So really, really powerful here, and it will really streamline that process. And then one more part that I really want to focus on here, because the topic today is HITRUST and SOC 2, I want to show you how that there can be that, working at both can really just create a streamlined process here. So for instance, let's say security awareness training. This is an example I always like to do because security awareness training is relevant for every organization, right? And it's going to be in scope for any security standard. This is just an example saying, hey, we're Vanta. Let's say you have a platform connected to Vanta or using Vanta supported security awareness training that we provide to folks. You have that in place. It's passing. That's great. Okay, great. How does that actually impact our controls? How does this permeate across all of these frameworks that we're trying to tackle? Well, you can actually directly see that the cross mapping of these controls right here. So you can see that, hey, I'm doing security awareness training for SOC 2. I'm also doing it for HITRUST, right here. So I think that's when we talk about deduplicative efforts, we're talking about, hey, we want to make sure that you're meeting these in an efficient manner and making sure you're taking credit for all the work that you're doing across the board that might be applicable to multiple frameworks. This is how we do that. So it's really, again, if you already have SOC 2, going from SOC 2 to E1, we've been really driving that point home. It's not going to be going from 0 to 1. You're going to really be in a really good spot already because you're already addressing these tests. You're already having these controls in place for SOC 2. And then just really accounting for those deltas from there, and also vice versa too, right? You're already going for HITRUST E1. You can just go into the platform and see, hey, whoa, we're actually pretty close to SOC 2. We actually have a lot of these already in place. So I think that's, again, it goes to the power of using a platform like Vanta, where you can really tackle those multiple frameworks in congruence with each other. So that's really what I wanted to highlight here today. And we have a ton of questions coming in, which is awesome. So we can definitely take some time to go into that. But I just want to highlight on the left here, like we spoke about, when I talked about the layer cake, Vanta does a lot. It's a powerful platform. We also have a dedicated risk management module. So you can actually have your risk register and manage your risk there. We have a vendor risk management module where you can manage third-party risk. You can actually collect those SOC 2 reports, analyze those SOC 2 reports, see if there are any findings, making sure that some of your key vendors have perhaps HITRUST certifications, things of that nature, being able to track your assets. And of course, like I spoke about, a trust center, being able to actually demonstrate trust to your customers, to your prospects, to your partners. So just at a high level, what the Vanta platform looks like. Of course, I'm always someone who's happy to dive deeper, but I want to be cognizant of time here and ensure that we can answer all of your questions, which is amazing that we're getting all of these, whether it be about Vanta, MyCSF, HITRUST, SOC 2. But that's the Vanta platform. I hope this gives you just a nice little taste of what Vanta does, what Vanta looks like, and of course how we have that integration with MyCSF and how we have that partnership with HITRUST and where that value comes in. So I'm just gonna stop sharing now.
Awesome.
Keep going.
Let's jump into the questions, and I want to throw out the public service announcements. We have a number of questions. Now is your chance to get more in there. We have about 8 minutes. So I'm going to start at the top based on the ones we have not answered yet. So what is the number of controls tested in the R2? It depends. It's right around, at the core, it's right around 200. But because the R2 is what we consider tailorable, you can add other standards, regulations, or frameworks, things like HIPAA, SOC 2, ISO, NIST, different flavors of NIST. You can actually expand that out. The biggest one I've ever seen is roughly 1,200 controls. I don't recommend that, but it is customizable. The average size R2 assessment is about 375. Does the E1 cover HIPAA requirements off the shelf, or do you need to tack on additional controls? Great question. The answer is it does not by itself for a number of reasons. HIPAA is actually a lot more complex than people realize, but you can add, the E1 is now tailorable for a smaller subset of those standards, regulations, and or frameworks. HIPAA is one of those. You can add that. I don't remember off the top of my head how many additional controls it will add, but it's not going to inflate the assessment up into 200 or 300 controls. How do you introduce an E1 to an organization who lives and breathes SOC 2? A lot of organizations tell me that a SOC 2 has satisfied their security requirements, so why an E1 now? I have thoughts. Ethan, anything jump out at you on that one, since you're dealing with the SOC 2 world a little more than I am?
Yeah, I mean, the way I like to tackle that is from two standpoints. E1, again, we talked to the value of E1 being threat adaptive, being really, addressing the current landscape of security threats. I think any security teams are becoming more and more aware of that, and I think that's something myself, as working with multiple security teams over the past couple of years, I've seen that awareness tick up of saying, okay, SOC 2 is a great baseline, but how can we start building on top of that, and how can we ensure that some of our vendors and partners are doing that as well? So I think it starts there, and then I would say, secondly, when it comes to the value of E1, is that a lot. Let's say you're working with an organization that is really potentially working with very sensitive data, or they're saying, hey, SOC 2 is great, but we need a next level of assurance here because you're touching data here that could really be impactful, that's really sensitive to our own customers, potentially personal data, PHI, whatever it might be. I think that's where E1 and in general HITRUST certification really comes in there, because it's going to be those more granular prescriptive controls that really address safeguarding that sensitive data. So for me, that's really where the value is. Ryan, if you have anything to add to that, definitely would love to hear it.
I think you hit on the major highlights. I mean, SOC 2, even though it's more common and arguably more commonly accepted, it's not gonna protect you. As a I don't want to say as a silver bullet, but because of the flexibility, because of the variability in the reporting, because each individual CPA firm writes the report on their own. There's no real oversight. The comparing a report to a report to a report becomes really, really, really difficult just in reading the reports, but even you have to dissect whether the controls that matter to you are actually in the report itself, because the organization was able to choose the controls they wanted to be tested against. So there's a lot of nuance there. Happy to dig in further and try to help articulate that in a more concise way, because I understand you probably only have a window of a very short period to try to convince an organization. But I would point to the statistics that we've shared in this presentation as at least the starting point, whereas it's impossible, one, to ascertain the breach rate for SOC 2 because there's no centralized way to do that, and two, There's a lot more SOC 2s out there in the world than there are HITRUST, and the breach rate is where it is. So you can draw some conclusions on your own. Okay, what are the thresholds a customer can use to require a HITRUST assessment versus only a SOC 2? And if I'm understanding this question, I'm not sure I understand the question, so I'm going to answer it in two ways. One, if you're the entity requesting an assurance, you can request HITRUST at any point in time. What I would encourage you to do is get it into contract language, though, because you don't want to be chasing people for an assurance mechanism. Have it legally binding in the contract. If you are subject to a request for an assurance mechanism, meaning you have a customer that's saying, hey, we want something, and maybe they're asking for a SOC 2 and you have HITRUST, then I think we just answered a bit of that in the last question. I would work with us at HITRUST, folks at Vanta. There is materials that we can provide to you that draws comparisons between the two to educate those customers on what they're getting with each. And then you can work to help them understand how HITRUST is different in some ways better. How does the E1 handle platforms that are automating the control for, say, let's say backup and replication controls through a third-party tool that is not HITRUST certified? So Ethan just showed us that they've got hundreds, thousands of integrations within the tool.
Hundreds trending towards thousands. We'll get there.
So Vanta is a great way to bring that evidence into your assessment. We at HITRUST still require that auditor, that external assessor, to test that evidence. We don't take things carte blanche. We are still going to put rules and guidelines around the testing of that evidence to ensure that it's what it's supposed to be and what it's saying. Not that we don't trust Vanta, but we have to walk the dog on this to make sure, because this is real. This is, in healthcare, people can literally be hurt or worse if we're not protecting systems. So the organization does not have to be HITRUST certified to utilize the evidence. In some cases, you can either do an integration, use the integrations through Vanta, or if there is no integration, you can request evidence directly from that third party, and that becomes the evidence the external assessor will then test and validate. The next question, I should have answered this in a point in time. I think this was around the 0.6%. It was the R2 or E1I1. That breach statistic is inclusive of all three assessments. But I will caveat that with the overwhelming majority of the assessments in that pool are R2, because in 2002, the I1 had just come out. The E1 had not even come out. The E1 came out in 2023. So it is inclusive of the E1 and the I1, but the majority of those assessments were the R2. Someone virtually high-fiving on the insurance news. I will high-five you back. The next question is around, do you have to buy MyCSF? And that was answered by another attendee accurately. You still will have to get MyCSF, but you'll able to push all that information from Vanta into MyCSF, which actually is a cost-saving measure. A lot of organizations either have to do it on their own, or they work with their external assessor to do it, which external assessors don't work for free. Will HITRUST offer this on other compliance automation tools, i.e. Drata, or only Vanta? Man, what an awkward question. But here we are. We're going to answer it. So right now, Vanta is the only one. We will, at some point, I don't have the exact timeline, expand that out. And it will be offered in multiple fashions. We at HITRUST are committed to trying to make our assessments not easier, but less painful. And this is a part of that effort. Ethan, I don't know if you have any comments.
Yeah, definitely. For HITRUST himself, I think making it easier for folks to get these HITRUST certifications, because it's so important in the security world, is definitely great. But from the Vanta side, we're grateful that we have that partnership for now. And of course, it's just, we just keep building upon it too, right? Because that's my CS7 integration was pretty new as well. Only came out we actually released it only a couple of weeks ago.
Yep.
So no, definitely like that portion has been incredibly valuable for especially our Vanta customers who are now being able to tackle HITRUST in a far more efficient and seamless manner than they were before.
For sure. Okay, last two questions. Oh wow, we're over on time. So the approximate cost really hard to tell you. There's so many factors on both sides of the coin for pricing for HITRUST in Vanta. If you're curious, feel free to reach out to either Ethan or I, and we can walk you through that. How does SOC 2 impact government contracting? I don't know of too many government agencies that take SOC 2 just straight up. There's usually some other kind of process. So I don't have the exact answer. I'm not sure it gets you very far. For instance, I talked to the FedRAMP PMO pretty consistently, and they flat out told me they will not accept SOC 2. They have told me they are going to accept HITRUST, just a matter of how and when they'll accept it. I don't know how. I'm not confident that you'll get very far in the government with a SOC 2. Okay. If you're still here, I want to say thank you for staying over. We did go over, but the questions were great, so I wanted to make sure we got all of them answered. Any questions that you may have, you can find me on LinkedIn. My email address is ryan.patrick@hitrustalliance.net. Ethan, your email address is?
ethan.heller@vanta.com.
There you go. Feel free to reach out to us. Happy to answer more questions or dive deeper into any of this. Otherwise, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day and the rest of your week. Ethan, thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks, Ryan.